Search through pictures of almost any society event of the 90s and 2000s and you'll probably see her, Ghislaine Maxwell.
But did Ghislaine Maxwell use her connections for something unimaginable? She stands accused of grooming underage girls for her ex-boyfriend and confidant, Jeffrey Epstein.
What was happening outside of this very small look, right? Like this very tightly conceived picture of Jeffrey and Ghislaine, but
they've controlled it very well.
In December 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty of recruiting and trafficking underage girls for Mr. Epstein. Now, for anyone following the scandal, the verdict wasn't a surprise. But what might be a surprise was how little attention this case received. Almost no one spoke about it. The media completely ignored it. The trial was instead hidden behind the real big news that Joe Rogan said a bad word 10 years ago. Now, to any rational person, this might raise some questions. Questions like, why would one of the biggest scandals in the last decade, a scandal that spawned endless documentaries, memes, and suspicions, be so hidden? Well, to understand this, you have to think like an elite, because those involved in the scandal are some of the world's most influential people. The royal family, Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, Kevin Spacey, Matt Groening, and so many more. So the question is, what would you do if you were one of these influential people with certain ties to the court case? Would you be upfront, honest, and transparent to the public? Would you really want the world knowing the depths of your depravity? Or would you do everything you can to hide this trial from the public? Well, I think we all know the answer to this question. So then how would you go about censoring this trial? Well, that's where things become very interesting. But to understand how to censor this trial, we first need to understand who Ghislaine Maxwell really is. Ghislaine Maxwell was born into the elite. Her father, Robert Maxwell, was a very interesting man. According to the British Foreign Office, Maxwell's father was a possible double or triple agent. He was, quote, a thoroughly bad character and almost certainly financed by Russia. He had links to MI6, the KGB, and Israel's Mossad, having done, quote, more for Israel than can today be told. But not only was he a spy, he was a media tycoon, owning newspapers like the Daily Mirror and the Daily News. With such a notable father, Ghislaine was granted access into the elite from birth, and with this came important contacts from all around the world.
She worked for her father as director of Oxford United Football Club, which he owned, and at his newspaper, The European. Robert Maxwell even named his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, after her.
In the following years, Ghislaine became a prominent figure in Manhattan high society, regularly meeting men like Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Donald Trump, and the Pope. But where was this money coming from? It became apparent that Robert Maxwell had stolen hundreds of millions, causing the Maxwell family to be completely bankrupt. So how did Ghislaine have a mega mansion in New York? How was she a part of high society? Well, this was all funded by a secretive man known as Jeffrey Epstein, because in return for a big house and a luxury lifestyle, Ghislaine would provide Epstein with wealthy and powerful connections. She would also be the one to lure in Epstein's victims and keep them in check, developing an elite trafficking ring centered around Epstein and his clients' tastes.
A sex trafficking ring which enabled his rich and influential friends and associates to share in his perversion.
But after Epstein's trafficking ring became too obvious to ignore, he was eventually prosecuted. Now this was an issue for a lot of influential people. We're talking about the people who shape society. So one day whilst inside his jail cell, Epstein magically vanished under completely totally normal circumstances.
Very uncomfortable when people say he did commit suicide.
That's a bit weird, isn't it?
Well, I started asking them questions. Like, why do you think that? Like, did you look at the autopsy? Did you ever hear Michael Baden speak about it, where he talks about the ligature marks at the bottom of his neck, which indicate he was strangled? Did you hear about the broken bones in his neck? Like that don't exist normally when people hang themselves. They usually are only from someone being strangled. There's a desire, the camera thing, the security guards conveniently sleeping. Like, there's so much.
It's almost like there's some kind of glaring reason these powerful men vanished Epstein forever. It's almost like this was a warning to other witnesses and Ghislaine Maxwell to keep their mouths shut. But I wouldn't dare suggest that this is the case, given that this could get my video removed. But Maxwell could see what was going on, and following this, Ghislaine fled, because she knew what was awaiting her. The elite still had some loose ends to tie up, meaning Ghislaine had a very serious target on her head. And unfortunately for Ghislaine, her hiding wouldn't last all too long. In July 2020, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested at her secluded mansion in the US state of New Hampshire. So now comes the trial, but I want you to think, if you're an elite, what would you do in this situation? The public is now already questioning the situation extensively. The media is becoming forced to report on this. So what tool do you have in your arsenal? Everyone knows what really happened to Epstein, so can you repeat that again? Well, you have to silence through other means. One way of doing this is through the media. If you can control the media, you control the narrative. So if you're an elite with some inconvenient ties to the court case or Maxwell herself, you have to downplay the situation. You have to distract the public. Which is why during the Maxwell trial, the media would begin to churn out some unusual stories. One of those stories was published by The Atlantic. During the unfolding of the Maxwell trial, The Atlantic put out an article claiming that child trafficking was a fake epidemic, labeling the whole thing a silly moral panic. Why would The Atlantic publish a story this ridiculous? No one would actively support this position. In fact, probably no one's ever thought this in their life. So why did The Atlantic post this? Well, The Atlantic is run by a powerful woman called Laurene Powell Jobs, the widow of Steve Jobs. And I think it's fair to say that by looking at some of the photos of them together, it's very clear that they had a strong connection. And the thing is, this isn't just The Atlantic. Jeff Zucker, and in particular Zucker's wife, were also long-term friends of Ghislaine Maxwell. So it makes sense as to why CNN buried the Maxwell story completely. And now, according to Project Veritas, CNN's producer for Jake Trapper had his electronics, hard drives, and other belongings seized by the Fairfax County Police. Not to mention Chris Cuomo's role in advising his brother on how to deal with sexual assault allegations. Another weird coincidence was that at the time of Ghislaine's trial, the editor for the Daily Mail randomly stepped down from the company, which was a strange move considering all the cozy photos of the two together.
We will get a full list of the famous American identities who turned up at Epstein's properties?
I hate to say it, but if I had to bet on it right now, I would not be betting on it. And it's American identities, it's international identities. They're very, very, very prominent, powerful people have been named as being involved in some way with Epstein and Maxwell. Witnesses are all testifying under pseudonyms, so we really have very limited information. And then layer on top of that, the media coverage has been really, really, really sparse.
But of course, this was only the start of the many coincidences that would help censor the whole trial. For example, Epstein had no legitimate sources of income to fund his lifestyle, but of course this was never questioned. Just like how the hidden cameras that infested Epstein's rooms have all been hidden away. We're talking about cameras that recorded some of the most evil and reprehensible acts by the world's most powerful somehow vanishing. So where did these videos go? And why is this question never brought up? The Washington Post, The Atlantic, CNN, The New York Times, none of them said a word. But what they did talk about, however, was Joe Rogan and his menacing podcast. A podcast that completely outperforms all mainstream media outlets. A podcast that actually voices balanced, authentic, and objective viewpoints. Somehow this podcast became the frontline news across the world, with Joe Rogan coincidentally being cancelled just around the time the documents from the court case were to be unsealed. Okay, so there's many coincidences here, which shows that controlling the media's reporting is very, very helpful. But even still, social media makes controlling the flow of information that much harder these days. Unless, of course, you're the ones who control big tech. But before we get onto that, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Private Internet Access. VPNs are one of the best ways to stop companies like Facebook stealing all your personal information and data. By changing your IP address and rerouting your internet traffic through an encrypted tunnel, Private Internet Access hides your online activity from your internet service provider, network administrator, and government sensors. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, as Private Internet Access uses world-class next-gen server infrastructure in over 75 countries, providing you a secure, reliable VPN connection anytime, anywhere. Private Internet Access never records or stores user data, and their no-logs policy has been proven multiple times in court. In fact, Private Internet Access's VPN is 100% open source, and its code is public so that anyone can see how private its service really is. Almost no other VPN is this transparent. Signing up for Private Internet Access is risk-free, with a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. And for a limited time only, Private Internet Access is offering you guys 3 years plus 4 months free for just $1.98 a month. So protect yourself by pausing the video and click the link in the video description below to claim this affordable offer right now. Now, big tech has always censored content related to Maxwell and Epstein. Facebook and YouTube are always censoring and fact-checking memes about Epstein. But it was during the Maxwell trial, when all the connections between the elites and Epstein unraveled, did big tech get to work. The worst example of big tech censoring this trial came with the Maxwell Trial Tracker's account on Twitter being suspended. Now, I've already talked on this channel about how Twitter actively silences free speech for their own reasons. But it also seems they're willing to do the dirty work for others. The Ghislaine Trial Tracker had gained 525,000 followers just 2 weeks after its creation. This was in response to people being deprived of any real information about this case. The Ghislaine Trial Tracker merely tracked and recorded what was going on in Ghislaine's trial to give people some insight. But this was far too damaging for those tied to the case. So of course, Twitter decided to pull the plug and suspend the account. And I'm sure that Ghislaine's sister Isabel serving as the technology pioneer of the World Economic Forum has nothing to do with it. It's these sensory actions that serves as a reminder of the Epstein trial. Like for example in the court case regarding Epstein's involvement with Deutsche Bank, where a judge had been assigned to assess whether the bank had monitored Epstein's accounts closely enough and whether they were willfully ignorant of his dealings. Now just 4 days after the judge was assigned to the case, a hitman dressed in a FedEx uniform showed up to the judge's house and murdered her son and critically wounded her husband. And so when it comes to Ghislaine Maxwell's trial, what will be next? What comes next when censorship of the media and big tech isn't enough to hold back vital information? Who or what will be the next sacrifice? Why are the elites so scared of this trial and the information within it? Well, the answer should be simple by now. The top politicians, celebrities, billionaires, and other members of the establishment are just as guilty as Ghislaine. Just as guilty for the trafficking of young girls on Epstein's private island, Little St. James. This is because without these high-end elite customers, the ones who fund Epstein's lavish lifestyle, Epstein's network would never have been as big as it is today. I can't say who's actually involved, but what might raise some concerns is that someone like Bill Clinton took at least 26 trips on the Lolita Express, or in other words, Epstein's private jet, where he would ditch his Secret Service for 5 of those trips. It might also be concerning that someone like Bill Gates flew on Epstein's private jet 5 years after Epstein was convicted. It might be concerning to think the elite would kill, bully, and censor into silence one of the most important trials of the last decade. But I wouldn't dare claim any of this, as this video will get removed instantly, which is a fact that tells you a lot about why you never heard anything about this trial and probably never will for the foreseeable future.